us more about your work, particularly about the profiles of Mexican immigrant entrepreneurs?
Yes, sure. First of all, I want to tell you a little bit about the purpose of this study. The purpose of the study was to develop a typology of Mexican migrant entrepreneurs living in the US and of the business ventures that they undertake. Once we achieve this development of the typology, we also aim to determine the association between the entrepreneur's profile and the kind of businesses they create. So talking about this typology that Pablo mentioned, can we show the first slide, please? So I want to tell you a little bit about the criteria that we took into account. If we move to the third one, please. So we took into account several different criteria, as you can see here. And this criteria, I'm sorry, the previous one. Thank you very much. So we took into account the education of the entrepreneurs. Why did we take this into account? Because I must say that there's a lack of consensus in several different publications regarding the definition of high-skilled migrants. There are some academics who consider high-skilled migrants those ones who have at least a bachelor degree. But there are other academics that do not give a lot of importance to the academic degree, but to the set of skills, competences, knowledge, specialized knowledge that the immigrants develop throughout their life history in the host society, in this case in the United States. So that's why we decided to take into account the education. We also consider the economic situation of migrants, because we found out that there are some migrants that arrive in the US with a very sound economic legacy. That was very common in the past, like 2 decades ago. But nowadays, this has changed, and there are many immigrants arriving in the United States with not such consolidated economic legacy. So they really depend on the success of their business to survive, basically, in the United States. We also consider the motivations to migrate, because there are some positive motivations, just like looking for better business opportunities, also looking for better education opportunities for their children, or simply looking for a perceived higher quality of life. But on the other hand, there are also, unfortunately, some negative motivations that refer basically to institutional weaknesses of the home country, in this case of Mexico. We also consider the experience of the immigrant entrepreneurs, basically labor experience. In some cases, they develop this experience while in Mexico. In some other cases, they reach this experience in the United States. We took into account the time that they have been living in the United States, their migration status, and the networks that they build, because there are some entrepreneurs that rely on co-ethnic networks. There are some others that record to Hispanic networks, and there are still some others that are part of the mainstream networks. So considering all the previous criteria that I just mentioned, these characteristics impact the level of integration of these entrepreneurs to the host society. I will go back later to this slide, but if we can advance to the next one, please. So now that I have mentioned these criteria, Pablo was talking about these 7 different types that we found out. Because of time restraints, I'm not going to go into detail with each one of these characteristics. If you want later, you can read the full report. But as you can see, we identify commuters, expatpreneurs, the well-off millennials, the stubborn millennials, the tycoonpreneurs, the self-made entrepreneurs, and finally the comprehensivepreneurs. And what I want to mention is a very high level of heterogeneity between all these groups. So that was very interesting because they are very different, not only in terms of their demographic characteristics. And when I talk about demographic characteristics, I mean, for example, their age. As you can see, there are two groups of millennials, people who are very young and who are basically operating in very advanced and sophisticated sectors that basically are related to information technologies, but some of them are also working in engineering, in science. And the age is not the only demographic aspect, but also, for example, their civil status, if they migrate with children or without them. Also, there are other kind of characteristics. For example, some of them only operate their businesses in the US. Some others only operate their business in Mexico, but they are living in the United States along with their families. And some others operate simultaneously their businesses in Mexico and the United States. And some of them are traveling back and forth between Mexico and the United States. That corresponds, for example, to the first type of entrepreneurs, commuters. And there are also some other distinctions. For example, a very interesting case is the last category, the comprehensivepreneurs, who arrive in the United States without any kind of education, without any kind of economic support, but throughout a lot of effort, a lot of work, and also a lot of vision, they became very successful entrepreneurs, and not just successful, but also people who are very recognized in both the home and the host communities because of the social work that they also undertake in both communities. I also want to mention that a different characteristic that we identify is how all these entrepreneurs deal with the institutional challenges that they face in the United States. I want to emphasize this because sometimes we tend to think that only the low-skilled traditional migrants are the ones who have to deal with a lot of obstacles, with a lot of challenges, but that's not true. Also, the high-skill migration has to deal with different kind of institutional challenges, such as discrimination sometimes, such as racism sometimes, and some other times with other kind of situations, such as the difficulty that they find to get their academic degrees that have been obtained in Mexico, the problems that they face to have these degrees recognized in the United States. And some other challenges, such as not getting access to financing, at least initially. Because they have to build a financial background, and sometimes the background that they already have in Mexico is not valid in the United States. So basically, they have to start from zero in order to get these financing opportunities. Once they build this financial background, then it is easier to get this financing, and I will say that it's easier than in Mexico, but it takes time to build this financial background. So as I said before, there are so many details, so much information about each type, but we do not have enough time. So those are my most important remarks about this, Pablo.
Thank you, Dr. Salamanca. And in kind of thinking about this, your research also identified several types of business profiles as well. Do you think you could touch to those a little bit, along with the entrepreneur profiles?
Yes, of course. So maybe if we go back to the previous slide. Okay, so some minutes ago, I was concentrating the attention on the left side of the screen. Now, if you pay attention to the right side of the screen, Here we have also the criteria that we took into account in order to make the classification of the business ventures that these Mexican immigrant entrepreneurs in the US are considering. And as you can see, we consider the location of the business, the size, the sector in which it is operating, the target market. For example, this was interesting because many of them continue targeting only co-nationals, the co-ethnic market, but some others have moved to targeting the Hispanic markets, and some others have gone beyond to target the mainstream community. We also consider the sustainability of the business, not only in the sense of surviving, but also in the sense of being able to scale the business, to open, for example, sometimes new subsidiaries, or to implement some research and development projects, or projects that deal with the so-called knowledge economy. The other criteria was, of course, the number of employment positions that they create. And finally, the structure. The structure refers to the fact that some Mexican immigrant entrepreneurs prefer to operate as what we call solopreneurs, in the sense that they do not partner with anybody. And this is very interesting because sometimes this responds to a deeply rooted cultural behavior of Mexicans, in the sense that sometimes we do not trust a lot each other and we prefer to go by ourselves. Of course, that was not the explanation in all the cases. Some other entrepreneurs prefer to not go into partnerships just because of pragmatic reasons. And then we have other kind of entrepreneurs that have a different structure, and yes, they create partnerships with some other Mexicans or with some other Hispanics or other migrants from other countries, or even with some native people from the US. Can we go to the next slide and then the next one, please? Yes, that one. Thank you very much. So these are the two different types of entrepreneurial ventures that we identify. We have on the left side the bootstrap entrepreneurial ventures, and this was very interesting because it was, of course, not something that we were trying to create intentionally, but the results. I forgot to mention that. How do we get the results? It was through in-depth interviews that we apply to several entrepreneurs, and it was also through an online survey that we apply throughout several months. So it was interesting because one of the types of business tend to be founded by women, and these businesses tend to create between 10 and 50 employment positions. And I really want to emphasize this because we realize that these entrepreneurs are really contributing to the economy of the US, creating different jobs. We all have heard about this rhetoric of buy American, hire American, and the fact that sometimes immigrants take away the jobs of the native people, and this is not necessarily true. Mexican entrepreneurs are creating employment positions in the US. This first typology concentrates on management services, and most of these women have developed their labor experience while in the US. On the other hand, if we pay attention to the right side of the screen, we have the strategic capital allocation, and these tend to be business founded by men. They create small size business with between 1 and 10 employment positions, or medium sized businesses that create over 50 employment positions. And the kind of sectors where they operate are slightly different. They are, most of them are operating in the services sector. Education, entertainment, finance, coaching, but also, as I said before, something that we must really feel proud about it is that many Mexican entrepreneurs are also operating in very advanced and sophisticated areas, such as engineering, science. And what is different from the previous type, the previous group, is that most of these entrepreneurs have developed their business experience in Mexico. And then, of course, they foster and they cultivate and consolidate this experience while in the United States. So those are my main remarks, Pablo, about this typology.
Thank you. And some of the recommendations in the project that you have completed include that Mexican entrepreneurs could improve their incorporation into US society by getting more involved in the philanthropic activities, since they are the core of the American society. Could you tell us a little bit more about this, Dr. Salamanca?
Yes, sure, Pablo. I think this was one of the most important reflections of the study, because it says a lot about our social behavior. It was very, very interesting to find out that those Mexican entrepreneurs who have been living in the US for a while and who have become almost fully integrated into the US society underline the importance of getting actively involved in community service, in philanthropic activities, not only as a, let's say, a kind of networking strategy from a very, very pragmatic approach, but also as an acquired value that they pass on to the new generations. This is something that they immediately identify as a cultural trait of the native US people. So these Mexican entrepreneurs, they talk about, let's say, a certain kind of resistance of newly arrived entrepreneurs. Of course, I must mention that there are some exceptions, but many of them talk about this resistance of newly arrived Mexican entrepreneurs to be part of these philanthropic activities, which in the end prevent them from having a real integration into the US society. And I will say that most importantly, this prevent them from cultivating this genuine interest in their children. So just that was something that really grabbed our attention.
Wow. And thinking about this, how do you think that this research can help in terms of formulating future public policies, Dr. Salamanca?
Yes, if we can go to the next slide, please. Yeah, and the next one. Thank you. Yeah, so in terms of public policies, which I think is one of the most important implications of these kind of studies, I will separate these public policies in two different sets. So from the US side, the recent anti-immigrant rhetoric of the current government administration doesn't only affect traditional low-skilled migrants, but also high-skilled migrants. More restrictive migration policies do alter in different ways the performance of businesses of Mexican migrant entrepreneurs. And when I'm talking about altering in different ways, I refer, for example, to the level of investment, to the level of uncertainty that these entrepreneurs have to deal with, also to the client's perceptions, to the response of the mainstream community. So the implications are many. This may have a long-term effect on the US entrepreneurial ecosystem. For example, foreign young people who were considering studying their undergraduate or graduate programs in the US, let's say, for example, through an H-1B visa, Mexican students among them, are starting to perceive the US as a hostile country for foreigners. Indeed, many of these students may become future entrepreneurs. That's why I'm mentioning this. So the US is potentially losing these future entrepreneurs that, as we said before, are really contributing economically to the US through the creation of job positions. In the same vein, these stricter policies around visas, such as, for example, the EB-5 visa, that it's another kind of visa that many Mexican immigrants use, may push entrepreneurs to look for other host country alternatives. So I will say that those are the most important implications from the US side. From the Mexican side, the government has to harness the existence of previous transnational initiatives. When I'm talking about transnational initiatives, I refer to those kind of activities that bridge or that link both societies, the Mexican society and the US societies. So the government has to harness the existence of these previous transnational initiatives that brought together high-skilled Mexican migrants living in the US to recover their knowledge and expertise around different cross-border, legal, cultural, and investment topics. It is evident that Mexican migrant entrepreneurs have a very strong and a genuine desire of keeping links with their home country, and I'm not just talking at a nostalgic level, but also at a much more pragmatic and concrete level. By contributing to implement specific social and economic initiatives. What kind of initiatives am I talking about? For example, now that we are dealing with all these consequences of the pandemic, for example, initiatives that are related to education in vulnerable areas in Mexico, or the transfer of technology and best practices to micro and small companies operating in Mexico, or for example, the participation in public-private partnerships to create infrastructure projects, these kind of initiatives. Despite the austerity measures the Mexican government is committed to, it is possible to keep and even improve the links with the entrepreneurial diaspora in the US. Through the joint participation of business leaders, opinion leaders, and representatives of the Mexican government in the US. By the way, I have to comment that a lot of the entrepreneurs that we interview mention about the outstanding performance of many consuls in some states of the US, Mexican consuls working in some states of the US, such as Dallas, for example. So we can bring together all these different stakeholders in seminars, in forums that identify viable transnational projects and that determine how to implement those projects. Although this implies the responsibility of the different stakeholders involved, businessmen, associations, academia, the government, a leading group of each project will have to be defined that assumes responsibility and ensures the effectiveness of each project. So I will say those are the most important implications in terms of public policies.
Yes, definitely. Thank you, Dr. Salamanca. It's clear that as the U.S. and Mexico's ties become much closer, these conversations will need to continue to keep happening so that we can best meet the needs of both of our countries. Right now, we're going to get ready to move into question and answer time with Dr. Salamanca. If you have any questions, or if you'd like to expand on another topic, you could go ahead and submit your questions into the chat, and I'll be moderating those, and we will send them to Dr. Salamanca. And then while we're waiting, Dr. Salamanca, could you talk to us a little bit more about what the most surprising area of your findings was in your research? What were the most surprising things that you found during this project?
Yes, of course, Pablo. I think that for us, the most unexpected finding was how many times entrepreneurs express that regardless of the high level of education that they have or the vast amount of experience that they have accumulated throughout the years that they have been living in the US, they are not exempt from suffering, let's say, this institutional challenges in the US, the ones that I was talking about. And I say that this was like really unexpected because we tend to think about that low skill migration or what we call traditional migration are the ones who suffer this kind of situations such as discrimination or racism or lack of recognition of their qualifications. But no, that's not the situation. It happens as well to high-skilled migrants as well.
Mhm.
So sometimes we think that they are really a privileged group. To a certain extent, they are. But on the other hand, they also have to overcome a lot of obstacles.
Yes, definitely. And as we move into this question and answer time, we have our first question that just came in. Antonio is asking, which institutions or associations would you consider are the ones that support most Mexican entrepreneurs in the United States?
Yes, this was also a question that we asked to the people who we interview and through the survey that we applied. And most of them coincide that the local chambers of commerce are the kind of associations from which they receive the most support. They talk also about the importance of belonging not only to Mexican associations, but to have, let's say, a broader picture and try to belong to Hispanic associations. So many of them were talking about different examples of these associations. Of course, we have also to recognize, and many of them mentioned, the work of the Red Global de Talentos. And this Red Global de Talentos is associated to the Instituto de Mexicanos en el Exterior. And to be honest, most of them mentioned that this was like a very powerful kind of association in the past. Let's say during 2000 through 2006, 2008, but recently, unfortunately, the Mexican government has not paid enough attention to this Instituto de Mexicanos en el Exterior. Maybe this is related to what we were discussing, the austerity measures that the government has decided to take and that has been forced to take as well as a result of the pandemic of the COVID-19. But yes, they say that it used to be a much stronger kind of association that was really fostering this kind of transnational spaces I was talking about. And of course, they also mentioned the Asociación de Empresarios de México, but sometimes they consider that this association is very useful for social purposes, this social networking, daily life tips, but sometimes in order to concrete some businesses, the chambers of commerce can be more effective, or these Hispanic associations can be more effective.
Mm-hmm. Yes. The next question that we have is from Dora Zapata, and she asks, did you survey entrepreneurs around the country to gather your feedback, or were they from a specific region?
Yes, that's very important. As I mentioned before, when we made the research proposal to the Mission Foods Texas Mexico Center, of course, the main interest was Texas. So many of the in-depth interviews were conducted in Texas, but then the surveys, the online surveys that we apply, considered other states of the United States. We received a lot of responses from Chicago, from New York. We also received many responses from Washington as well, and many of them from Texas, which is, I think, very, very logical. From California as well. I forgot to mention California.
Oh, yes, it seems like there's a very wide range of representation with the states in the United States.
Yes.
Yes.
Yes, it was sent to all immigrants from United States. In fact, we contact several different consuls of the whole country, But let's say that the states that I mentioned are the areas from which we receive the highest number of responses.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yes, yes. And then Dora has a follow-up question. Do you have any insight into the impact of COVID-19 on Mexican entrepreneurs? Did many apply for and receive PPP loans?
Yes, of course, it's undeniable that the COVID-19 is going to have an effect on the migration in general, and specifically on entrepreneurial migration. So I will say that there are two important implications. One is the implication related to the H-1B visas that the Trump administration, even before the pandemic, has adopted stricter measures regarding this in order to foster the practice of multinational corporations of hiring natives before trying to hiring immigrants. So let's say that the COVID-19 pandemic is like the perfect scenario to have a strong argument to work even with more stricter policies regarding this. Why am I talking about the H-1B visa? Because as I said before, many of these students that get their studies in United States and that are working in these knowledge economy sectors, such as information technology, such as finance, health, energy, these kind of sectors, are the future entrepreneurs. So if you prevent these students coming to study in the United States and then later on working in the United States once they have their graduate degrees, then you are preventing to have all these future entrepreneurs. That's why I'm talking about the H-1B visa. And then the other kind of situation is the EB-5 visa that I also mentioned, that it's one of the visas that the businessmen use more frequently. Many Chinese businessmen, but also more and more Mexican executives are recurring to this kind of visa. And the Trump administration has decided to increase the minimum amount of money that they have to invest for this purpose. So that may generate that some of these entrepreneurs are going to consider other more flexible kind of alternatives. So I think that the COVID-19 doesn't really change the scenario for high-skill migration, but it gives like the perfect argument for the Trump administration to become even more stricter with some of the conditions and the prerequisites of these kind of visas.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Thank you, Dr. Salamanca. The next question comes from Ilse, and she says, "Hi, Dr. Salamanca. I was your student a few years ago at UDLA. Talking about the chambers of commerce and different associations, do you know if the Mexican government gives different support or offers programs to help the development of the high-skilled workers in the US and also Canada?"
Honestly, right now, no. There's not a specific support for this kind of high-skill migration coming from, and I mean entrepreneurial migration, coming from the Mexican government. But as I said before, there's an outstanding effort from very specific consuls working in different states, and they are doing a very, very interesting job in terms of trying to be this bridge I was talking about, to link these associations with some entrepreneurs in Mexico in order to foster some joint projects, investment projects, infrastructure projects, social philanthropic projects. And these instances, these consuls in different states of the United States are trying to organize symposiums, forums, trying to create these platforms where all these entrepreneurs, the Mexican immigrants working in the United States and the entrepreneurs that are in Mexico, come together along with other stakeholders that I mentioned before, such as the academia, such as the non-governmental organizations, some Mexican communities that are interested in fostering these kind of projects. So they are doing a good job in bringing together this. And I also have to mention that if we do not only consider migrant entrepreneurs or an entrepreneurial migration, if we extend the scope to high skill migration, in that sense, of course, in Mexico, we have the CONACYT that for many, many years has been providing different kind of scholarships. And I think that right now they are trying to concentrate their attention on the scholarships that are related to the knowledge economy, to these areas such as science, engineering, information technologies, energy, these kind of areas. But I didn't mention before that because that's about high skill migration in general, not specifically entrepreneurial migration.
Mm-hmm. Yes, the next question comes from Leticia McDonald, and she says, "Thank you for sharing these powerful research findings. In your opinion, which other areas would you consider important to conduct a sort of follow-up study to your study?"
Yes, we have talked so much about this with my colleague Jorge Alcaraz, because we find so many different areas where we must continue doing this research along, of course, with other academics. And for example, it's very interesting to make the distinction between genders. So we found this typology of businesses where we found this interesting result of some of these businesses founded by women and other ones by men, but we didn't have enough information in order to give specifications about the impact of gender on these entrepreneurial ventures. So I think that taking into account the gender, it's something that we need to look for further information about that. I think that another important distinction is another demographic factor, that is the age of these entrepreneurs. So we were like very surprised about the existence of these two specific typologies of millennials, because that's a different behavioral pattern if we compare with 2 decades ago, that many high skill, I'm not talking about the low skill traditional migration, but high skill migration in the past, they used to migrate at a much more mature stage of their life. And now it's pretty common that some very, very young entrepreneurs are migrating in order to take advantage of these innovation processes and all these knowledge economy areas. So I think that a further study has to pay even more attention to this demographic aspect, the age of the entrepreneurs. And there are a lot of different lines. I think that one of the most important lines is to extend the geographic scope, because even though we were able to receive some responses from different areas of the United States, most of them, as I said, come from Texas. So that may generate like a kind of bias in the research. So I think that it's expensive to conduct these kind of quantitative studies that are very, very broad in terms of the geographic scope, but it is necessary.
Mm-hmm. Yes. The next question comes from Jorge Quiroz, and he asks, the US under the Trump's administration has kind of closed opportunities to business immigrants. On the other hand, Mexico is turning very difficult to live in terms of business. What are the Mexican business migrants doing to overcome these difficulties?
Yes, it's absolutely true what Jorge Quiroz is mentioning. I was mentioning at the beginning of the conversation that there are positive and there are as well negative motivations. So it's true that unfortunately, one of the negative motivations is the economic situation that currently we are living in Mexico, and that as a consequence generates very high levels of unemployment. And this is like a domino effect that also increases the levels of insecurity and all these institutional voids or weaknesses that we all know about Mexico. So I think that the migrants, the high-skilled migrants, are still considering going to other places in order to look for better economic opportunities, at least in the medium term, while we recover from the very, very intense economic effects of the pandemic. But I will say that due to this very strict rhetoric of the current US administration, now some Mexican migrant entrepreneurs are starting considering other kind of alternatives, such as, of course, Canada, that has always been considered, but also more distant kind of alternatives such as Australia. And some other entrepreneurs are considering other countries of Latin America that previously have not been taken into account, such as Peru, such as Chile, of course, Argentina, Colombia. So I think that there's another kind of geopolitical situation that is exerting some influence in this area. That is the relation between China and United States, it's interesting because it has like a double side, and one of these sides may benefit Mexico in the sense that China is moving some of the supply chains that they used to have in other areas. They are trying to move now these supply chains to Mexico, Central America, and some countries of Latin America. So that may push even more the motivation of some Mexican migrant entrepreneurs to consider other countries that in the past were not really taken into account.
Yes, and then as we get ready to end our time today, we have one more question from Gabriela Morlet, and she asks, could you please share with us the sources of information used for this research study?
Yes, of course. There are so many information sources that we have used. So if you want, through Jenny and through the Mission Foods Texas Mexico Center, of course, I can share with you all these information sources. Some of them are very academic sources, but some others are periodic publications that you can take a look at. And also you have available on the website of SMU the different research areas, and they are separated by topics, and one of these topics is migration, and you can find the full report of this research there. So yes, of course, I will be happy to share with you all the information sources.
Perfect. Thank you, Dr. Salamanca, for your time today, and for everybody for tuning in to today's panel presentation. I'll now turn over the platform to Jennifer so that she can conclude our presentation.
Well, thank you both. Thank you so much. Thank you, Dr. Salamanca, and thank you, Pablo, for wanting to participate. I know that people might have still some questions. Let's just say that we could go on talking for even a longer time, but we want to be very respectful of everybody's time. And just to follow up on that point, I just put on the chat, hopefully if everybody can see it. If not, we'll be writing up a follow-up email. If anybody is interested in learning more about this project, reading this project, we have it on our website, and I'll be happy to follow up. Gabby, I'll follow up with you just to make sure I let you know how you can reach out. If anybody else wants to read the full project where she lists all of her sources, I'll be happy to follow up with everybody. I'd like to thank you for joining us today. If you have more questions for Dr. Salamanca, let me just say that we'll be having our Spanish session in October, so stay tuned. We'll be announcing that through our social media. Look out for us on Twitter at SMU Texas Mexico, and on our website, of course. It was such a pleasure to be able to talk to you both today, and hopefully you all enjoyed it at home. Thanks for joining us, and we really look forward to see you in another webinar.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you to all the people who joined us today. Thanks, Pablo. Thanks, Jenny.
Thank you, everybody. Have a good afternoon, evening. Have a good evening.
Bye.
Bye.